Kia ora whanau, no mai, hara mai. Ko Harleen Hain, tako ingoa, ko te tumuaki o te whare wānaka o Otago aho. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou, no reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Good evening, everyone. My name is Harleen Hain, and I'm the Vice Chancellor here at the University of Otago, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2020 Hocken Lecture. 2020 has been a particularly difficult year for all of us, and it's absolutely wonderful that the sacrifices that we made prior to lockdown, during lockdown, and after lockdown have afforded us the kind of freedom that we are currently enjoying this evening. Now, one of the freedoms, of course, is that we have the opportunity to gather together in a large group, which is extraordinarily rare just about anywhere else in the world. Like you, I am sure that you are anticipating an outstanding lecture by our very inspiring Hocken speaker this evening. Now this year, the world has taught us many, many things. But one of the things that it has taught us is that it has underscored the importance of universities. At the beginning of each year, at our annual convocation ceremony, I remind our students of the words of Emeritus Professor Alan Musgrave. Human knowledge is important. It is the greatest achievement of our species. It is what, more than anything else, that sets us apart from the other creatures. It's what makes us the most important, the most powerful, and yes, the most dangerous critter that there is. It is because human knowledge is so important that universities charged with transmitting and extending that knowledge are also important. This year has been a cogent reminder of the importance of knowledge, of the importance of universities, and of the importance of archives like those held by the Hocken. The University of Otago is incredibly lucky to have the Hocken collection as a resource for our academics and our students, as well as a service to the wider research community. No other university in New Zealand or in Australia has a collection that is anywhere near as significant as this one. So it's not surprising that two recent recipients of the Royal Society of New Zealand's Aronui Medal for Humanities are Professors Tony Ballantyne and Professor Barbara Brookes, both of whom have worked extensively with the Hocken collections. Now, the annual Hocken Lecture, which we are enjoying this evening, was established to reinforce the active role of the Hocken in developing cultural understanding. It was also established to share the fruits of research conducted at the Hocken collection with a wider audience. And it's fantastic to see such a wide audience here this evening. No mai, hara mai, welcome. Now tonight, very shortly, we are going to have the opportunity to hear from Emeritus Professor Barbara Brookes. And very shortly, I am going to hand over to Professor Tony Ballantyne to introduce Professor Brookes. But on a personal note, I would like to acknowledge that Barbara and her husband, Emeritus Professor Paul Roth, were among the very first people that I met when I arrived in New Zealand in 1992. Now, I met the Brookes-Roth clan at the University of Otago Child Care Center, where many, many lifelong relationships started. In addition, Paul actually taught at my undergraduate college, Colorado College, before I arrived. At that stage, none of us probably knew that we would create lives and careers in New Zealand. The academic world is a very small one, and we are extremely lucky to have Emeritus Professor Barbara Brookes, Emeritus Professor Paul Roth, and their three sons as part of our world here at the University of Otago. I will now hand over to Professor Ballantyne. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou, no reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Tony Ballantyne ahau, ko o te mana kura o te kiti Aranui ki te whare wānanga nei. I'm Tony Ballantyne, and I'm the PVC Humanities here at the university, and I'm really delighted to be able to introduce our speaker this evening. Being asked to introduce Professor Emerita Barbara Brookes is both very easy, as there are so many positive things to say, and very difficult, especially for a Dunedin audience, because she is so well known. What can I say about Barbara that you do not already know? So in these brief framing remarks, I will imagine you don't know anything about her and introduce her in the conventional way. And then I'll offer a few reflections, I think, on some of the key features of her work, particularly her contributions to our institutional life, that I think are particularly useful in helping lead into her lecture this evening. In the middle of the year, Barbara retired after a very distinguished career here at Otago. Although she was born north of the Waitaki, raised north of the Waitaki, and that's not a bad thing, she was an Otago student, completing a BA Honours in History here before pursuing postgraduate studies in the United States. She returned to Otago and rose through the ranks in the History Department, becoming Professor and serving a long stint as Head of Department, 8.5 years, I think, Barbara. She was also a very prominent and influential figure on campus. Her leadership and service was wide-ranging within the university and beyond. And given this evening's occasion, it will not be a surprise that she was strongly engaged with the library and Hocken collections. Within her home discipline, she was an outstanding teacher and supervisor, and I'll say more about this shortly, as well as being a very important researcher. Barbara was a key player and remains a key player in two important historiographical shifts in New Zealand historical writing. The turn towards social history that began in the 1970s and the concomitant rise of women's and gender history, or then gender history. Her substantial body of research in the later field, which was advanced through many chapters, journal articles, and edited collections, underpinned her landmark A History of New Zealand Women, published by Bridget Williams Books. Christmas is not far away. If you do not own this, this is still a great gift for a special person in your life. It's also substantial enough that it counts as an exercise machine. But beyond these fields that we all associate Barbara with, she's played a key role in opening up other important areas of research in New Zealand. She has made a very substantial contribution to the history of medicine and also to the history of mental health. She has been a key figure in initiating work on the history of emotions here in New Zealand, particularly through some path-breaking scholarship on shame and its histories. Here, as is typical of Barbara, there was a very tight connection between her research and teaching. She developed a great undergraduate paper on scandal and shame in New Zealand history. Such a brief recap can't really serve or offer, a full justice to such a rich career, one that's been so very distinguished. But I think I can just note some key recent markers of her successes. And these include the accolades for this book. That won the Hocken New Zealand Book Award for the Best Illustrated Non-Fiction volume. It was shortlisted for the 2017 Ernest Scott Prize in Australia and New Zealand, the 2017 Burt Roth Award, the W.H. Oliver Prize, and the 2016 New Zealand Heritage Non-Fiction Book Prize. And in 2018, as the Vice-Chancellor mentioned, she won the Humanities Aotearoa Medal from the Royal Society of New Zealand Te Aparangi. Sorry. The citation recognising her particular contribution as, quote, putting women at the centre of a substantial and internationally recognised body of scholarly work. That, of course, has been a career-long commitment. It is very apposite that Barbara won that prize in 2018, the 125th anniversary of women's suffrage in New Zealand. And in that same year, she was also made a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit for services to historical research into women. I'm going to end shortly. But as a way of leading into this evening's lecture, I want to highlight one aspect of Barbara's career that is particularly significant for understanding her importance here at Otago. And it will help, I think, to frame what we will hear from her this evening. One of the defining characteristics of Barbara's work was her commitment to training students in the disciplines at the heart of historical research, defining research questions, locating and exploring as rich and diverse body of archival material as possible, and building strong arguments through the craft of writing. Barbara was a great champion of the old-style honours program here at Otago, where there was a dedicated stream of theory and method classes for our undergraduates, preparing them for their fourth year of study, which included a very substantial piece of original archival research. And looking around the room, I see many people that went through that experience. When we moved to the new model, where the honours program became a one-year postgraduate clip-on, Barbara was also pivotal in redesigning our undergraduate programs, making sure that we had great papers preparing students who might go down that pathway, but also opening up the opportunity for other undergraduate students to learn about theory, method, and historiography. So Barbara was absolutely committed to cultivating a very rich tradition of student research here. And that was a tradition that trained her, it was a tradition that trained me, and that has continued to train our students in today. So I think she deserves really huge recognition for her commitment to what we might think of as that feedback loop between teaching and research. Central to this was archival research, something that Barbara has been an unwavering champion of, just as she has been a tremendous supporter of Hocken collections, a national treasure that holds an immensely rich body of material. So it is fantastic to have her back with us in Dunedin this evening, and I am delighted to invite you all in joining me in welcoming her to deliver this Hocken lecture.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you all for being here. It's lovely to see such a lovely crowd, people I know. Today, courtesy of the magnificent bequest he left us, we think of Thomas Moreland Hocken as a collector. My aim today is to re-emphasise his original profession, a medical doctor, and to examine how the collection he initiated can throw light on poor health and medical treatment in the past. Why is this important? My original research in the Hocken might provide a partial answer. As a fourth-year student in 1976, I worked on the 1930s controversy about deaths from septic abortion. In doing so, I uncovered the then unspoken history of women's fears about an unplanned pregnancy, which, in the depths of a depression, meant precarious family finances would tip into disaster. A number of women were willing to risk their health, if not their lives, through procuring a criminal abortion in order to preserve their existing family, as this source, now in the Hocken, told me. The statistics of deaths led me to uncover a history of attempts at fertility control which had been regarded as a largely private, and in the case of abortion, as a criminal matter. As the historian of medicine, Erwin Akkenecht, observed, whether a person gets sick at all, what kind of disease he or she acquires, and what kind of treatment he or she receives depend largely on social factors. Deaths from abortion were a clear example of the way social factors gave rise to what was regarded as a medical crisis. When I studied the history of medicine in graduate school under the direction of the great historian of medicine Charles Rosenberg, I became even more aware of how that history dealt with the big themes of life, birth, death, and the inherently moral questions of how societies provided for the sick and dealt with threats to health. Rosenberg's landmark book, The Cholera Years, demonstrated that a focus on epidemic disease opened up nearly every aspect of society to historical consideration and revealed the contingent nature of medical knowledge. In the face of cholera in England in 1832, for example, King William IV commanded, and I quote, a public day of fasting and humiliation to beseech God to remove that previous disease. Our current Prime Minister urged us to work as a team of 5 million in order to prevent the spread of COVID-19. We are now, I think, well aware of the differential impact the influenza pandemic of 1918 had on Maori and Pākehā. But how did our knowledge of public health develop? One way it did so was through the work of fifth-year medical students at the University of Otago, and this was a project by one of those students. From the 1920s through to the 1970s, they carried out research exercises which are a tremendous resource housed in the Hocken now for researchers. I've consulted them for a variety of projects and have recently had students use them for a blog project in the Historical Methods course. Some of these blogs have appeared on the Medical Humanities blog corpus that my co-editor Sue Wotton and I edit. I have had great pleasure in supervising a number of students who have drawn on the Hocken collections to work on aspects of healthcare. Some have examined the health professions, from the reception of Jewish refugee doctors and the evolution of the professions of nursing and dental nursing. Others have examined aspects of diseases, the impact and control of goiter, of hydatids, and of tuberculosis. And in the case of Pamela Wood, the cultural history of dirt that made 19th century Dunedin known as Mud Eden. Diana Brown's MA thesis and now fine biography of Muriel Bell was based on Bell's papers in the Hocken, which have recently been inscribed on the prestigious UNESCO Memory of the World New Zealand Register. Other students have looked at aspects of institutional history, such as Ashburn Hall or the Bassam Hospital, the latter which provided pioneering care for children born with cleft palate. In all of these studies, personal and familial suffering sits alongside national policies and professional interests. It is this conjunction of factors that makes the history of medicine so compelling and which lies in its power to inform us today in the era of a new pandemic. I will examine those factors in 3 ways. First, by an examination of a case involving Dr. Hocken in 1871. Second, by exploring a patient's perspective in 1921. And third, by taking a broad view of attitudes towards experts in Matarongi Māori, Tohanga, over the 20th century. I want to begin with Thomas Moreland's Hocken's practice in Dunedin, suggesting how one of his cases reveals insight into personal suffering, professional rivalries, and public policy. This case became apparent to me through the wonderful digital source Papers Past, to which the Hocken has contributed. Those digitised newspapers make it possible to track people's public activities in a way they might never have imagined. Ali Clark has discussed some dimensions of this case in her prize-winning book, Born into a Changing World. So here's the young Dr. Hocken. In December 1870, when the 34-year-old Dr. Hocken had been practicing in Dunedin for 8 years, he was called to the case of a woman who had been delivered of a stillborn child. Margaret Cochrane, wife of a commission agent, began labour in her Caversham home on Wednesday, December 14th, and the midwife who attended her previous births, Mrs. Ellen Waterhouse, was summoned. On Friday morning, Margaret, who had already borne 10 children and had 1 miscarriage, was delivered of a stillborn child. She later complained to the midwife of a pain in her abdomen, and Mrs. Waterhouse applied hot oatmeal bags to her swollen stomach and gave her castor oil. Concerned that his wife was not improving, on the following Tuesday morning, Edward Cochrane sent a message calling for Dr. Hocken, who duly came and prescribed medicines. Hocken suggested that Mrs. Waterhouse should have no more to do with the case. The following day, Mrs. Waterhouse returned and, seeing Mrs. Cochrane, said that Dr. Hocken should be here, that the patient was sinking. Mr. Cochrane went to summon Hocken, who was unavailable at that time. When he returned home, Cochrane found his wife dying. Dr. Hocken visited on Thursday afternoon, and Mrs. Cochrane died that evening. At the ensuing coroner's inquest, held at the Edinburgh Castle Hotel, inquests were commonly held in hotels at that time, Hocken and Dr. Alexander gave evidence that the death was the result of a protracted labour of 48 hours. In their view, Mrs. Cochrane's life would have been saved if skilled assistance had been sought at an earlier stage. The jury returned a verdict of death through natural causes and blamed the midwife for not calling in medical help at an earlier date. Significantly, they also recommended a reduction in medical charges to prevent such cases in the future. When first called to the case, Dr. Hocken asked Edward Cochrane why he had not had a medical man from the first. Cochrane answered that his wife wanted to economise and that Mrs. Waterhouse had attended her before. Hocken declared that if anything went wrong with this case, he'd sift it to the bottom. His concern may well have been the reason why Alan Waterhouse was charged with manslaughter in the Mayor's Court on the 31st of January 1871. I had fun finding out what a Mayor's Court was, but I'll tell you about that if you want to know later. The prosecution declared that Mrs. Waterhouse had shown criminal inattention by allowing a protracted labour and not calling in a medical man. Mr. Barton, for the defence, argued the medical profession brought the case purely to make this prosecution a vehicle for preserving their monopoly. Citing Russell on crimes, he argued that Mrs. Waterhouse was on exactly the same footing as a medical man, who, if they honestly exercised their best skill, but the patient died, were not guilty of manslaughter. He charged that Hocken and others intended to shut the assistance of midwives out from the poor, who could not afford medical men's high fees. While Dr. Hocken had the support of Dr. Alexander, 3 other doctors experienced in midwifery defended Mrs. Waterhouse. In the end, the bench decided that Mrs. Waterhouse had done her best, that culpable negligence and want of skill were unproved, and the case was duly discharged, with an outburst of applause in the court. Mrs. Waterhouse's trial makes us consider a time when women's lives were tightly bound to the numerous children they bore and the risks they took to bear them. We see the agony of her husband and think of her 10 other children left motherless. We also see the ambitions of medical men in a new colony, hoping to make their mark by asserting their scientific superiority and striving to limit the practice of healthcare for themselves. Hocken's concern about the quality of care was perhaps heightened by a previous encounter with Mrs. Waterhouse in his role as coroner, and not purely instrumental. But his own examination of the patient was shown to be cursory, and he was known to take at least £10 a day, which is the equivalent of $1,400 today, per day in fees. We see the public's objection to those high medical fees, with the jury asking that they be reduced, and their support for the midwife in an outburst of applause that greeted her discharge. In the course of the hearing, the lawyers also pointed out that there was no requirement for the licensing of midwives in New Zealand, and this raised an issue of public policy that was not resolved until the 1904 Midwives Act. The questions of who should attend birth and how they should be paid have continued to be subject to dispute up to the present day. In this case, we see the matrix in which medicine is embedded, that it is once social, economic, political, and cultural. My second example comes from 50 years later, and from the view of a privileged patient, with no desire like that which propelled Margaret Cochrane to economise. The first forays into the history of medicine were generally by medical practitioners who were fascinated by the role and practices of their predecessors. A.G. Hocken's Life of Dr. Hocken is a good example. Social historians from the 1970s onwards were keen to recuperate the experience of patients, asking questions such as how did patients access and experience healthcare? In the Hocken archives lie the correspondence of Mary Downey Stewart. Yeah, sorry about that. Oh, okay. I've said this before, but they are designed for male suit pockets. And I always forget. So the sort of history of medicine I was trained in, we were very keen to learn about the experience of patients. And in the Hocken archives lie the correspondence of Mary Downey Stewart, a woman from a well-to-do Dunedin family who moved as her disabled brother's hostess in the highest reaches of New Zealand society. William Downey Stewart's career, first as Mayor of Dunedin and then as a Member of Parliament and Cabinet Minister, was enabled, as historian Rachel Patrick has so well argued, by the labour of his older sister. Mary assisted him in coping with his lifelong debility caused by rheumatoid arthritis, which confined him largely to a wheelchair. It is to Mary's much briefer encounter with illness that I wish to turn, and I wish to thank Yvonne Wilkie for first bringing this to my attention. Since William Downey Stewart's return from war service in 1916, Mary devoted herself to his care and a continual search for cure. But in 1921, it was her turn to deal with ill health. Mary had been to see Dr. Agnes Bennett about her problems, who had heightened her concern about the possibility of cancer. This is Agnes Bennett. Dr. Bennett, Mary wrote, looked so serious during her examination, which led Mary to imagine that my womb and both breasts might be removed. Her concern was alleviated by a visit to the Bowen Street Hospital, begun by W.E. Herbert and Dr. H. Hardwick Smith. This is the hospital. Just across the road from Parliament. It was beside the old Alexander Turnbull Library. Bowen Street was one of the 260 private hospitals in the country run as business enterprises, 165 of which were maternity homes. When Mary asked Dr. Herbert if her condition was serious, he reassured her that he'd stake his life that whatever was happening with her ovaries wasn't malignant. "You are not to worry," he continued, "because we'll fix you up and take care of you." Unlike Agnes Bennett, who was reluctant to give her patient any unconfirmed diagnosis, Dr. Herbert made Mary feel as if he were a big brother. And I found this charming slide. The National Library supplied me this charming picture of Dr. Herbert with his 3 daughters. Mary Downey Stewart was suffering from an ovarian cyst. It was Agnes Bennett who first informed her that both her ovaries had been removed and how this would cause early menopause, a fact that Mary checked with Dr. Herbert. Her 13-pound ovarian cyst, which is nearly 6 kilos, appeared minor, she reported, compared to the 40-pound, 18-kilo cyst endured by a nun, which was removed by Dr. Barnett at Dunedin Stafford Street Hospital. Dr. Herbert told Mary her diseased ovaries were only a menace and reassured her that her voice would not get like a man's and there was nothing to worry about at all. Dr. Bennett, on the other hand, warned the early onset of menopause would likely cause depression irritability, and headaches, and so Mary should take time to convalesce. Mary was intrigued by the operation, asking Dr. Bennett for copies of the photos taken of the removed cyst. "My hat," she wrote. "What a butcher's shop it looks." Her brother did not share her enthusiasm for viewing the photographs when she attempted to show them to him and to others. He was shocked and disgusted and said, "I must never show them to anybody." Mary was well looked after in her private room at the hospital, tucked into a bed with a hot water bottle and supplied with good food for a month. Friends visited frequently, sent oysters and stout, quail, an abundance of flowers and whiskey and soda. When it came time to leave the hospital, Mary remarked how she would miss the nursing sisters very much and all the waiting on. As someone who spent her life waiting on her brother, this was a time of rare respite for Mary. She wrote, "It has been such a wonderful experience, one of the most wonderful in my life. The revelation of the kindness in the world and the revelation of God's nearness. I hope the latter will not leave me when I get back to the busy world again." Mary Downey Stewart had every assistance and comfort in Bowen Street Private Hospital, the kind of care that those with the resources could buy. Her recovery, however, wasn't entirely straightforward. She suffered the depression Bennett predicted, noting, "And yet with all my luxury, friends and love, I have my groggy days when I wish I had not come out of the chloroform and when I pray very earnestly that God will let me die." The operation, she concluded, was a flea bite compared with the effort it will need to get over the depression, just as Bennett had predicted. But in the end, the care of good friends and love of family members helped her through. The wealth and social connections of the Downey Stewart family ensured that Mary had the best of care for her operation. She chose to have it in Wellington, no doubt to be close to her brother, who at the time was Minister of Internal Affairs in the Reform government. In the Bowen Street Private Hospital, across from Parliament, she recorded her progress in letters to her sister Rachel. Hence, we can now read about her experience. Mary obviously felt herself the social equal of her doctors and able to ask them anything, including for the photos of her specimen. While she was pleased to be able to consult a woman doctor, she preferred the paternalism of Dr. Herbert to Dr. Bennett's realistic advice. The doctors followed her progress once she left the hospital, Dr. Herbert writing to her saying he could not take her depression seriously since it was foreign to her real nature. Many New Zealanders, however, did not have such ready access and such familiarity with their doctors, and few could afford a month away from their breadwinning or domestic duties. Mary Downey Stewart's ability to consult a woman doctor about her internal troubles was a privilege only available to a few, even if she preferred Dr. Herbert's paternalism. Most people could not afford to travel for specialised treatment. Those in rural districts were particularly disadvantaged. In 1919, the Otago Daily Times described Dunedin Hospital as extensive and modernly equipped, where patients had the service of a strong honorary staff. No such facility existed, the editorial pointed out, for the people of the Catlins district. But even Dunedin Hospital faced the problem of recruiting an adequate number of nurses, which one member of the hospital board suggested was due to nursing's low status compared to the new profession of dental nursing. The latter was more attractive to young women as it was better paid and required only 2 years as opposed to 3 years of training. Problems of recruiting a workforce and questions of access and equity in medical care, so central today, were equally debated in the past. Those debates led to the first Labour government's introduction of free hospital care for all in 1939, and its attempt to create free access to primary health care, strenuously opposed by the New Zealand branch of the British Medical Association. My third example takes a long view and examines the place of experts, tohunga, in all all branches of Matauranga Māori: warfare, growing crops, recounting history, and healing, to see how understandings of disease were embedded in cultural codes. In the Marsden Online, a wonderful resource for researchers that has made the Marsden collection available to scholars worldwide, Thomas Kendall recorded in 1815 how an atua had entered the chief Ruatara, making him ill and also making him a sacred person who no one could approach but a tohunga, or close family members. So the second sentence from the bottom, this is from the Marsden Online. Nearly a century later, tohunga had become the people most reviled by those Maori men who were the first to study Western medicine. Allegiance to tohunga became a cultural fault line. Men who regarded themselves as modern and scientific were scathing about their rival heathen counterparts, who they saw as a degraded version of the traditional high priests. Māori inhabited a porous world where spirits and gods made themselves known in numerous ways. Tohanga interpreted this world and how to behave in it. Christianity offered different interpretations, and the first Māori men who trained in medicine were pupils at Te Ate College, run by the Anglican Church. There, under the charismatic leadership of John Thornton, who had begun his career with the Church Missionary Society in India, they took Christianity seriously and began to abjure supernatural aspects of their own culture, and tohunga in particular. The men I am discussing here, Te Tere Ripa, Peter Buck, Te Rangihiroa, and Maui Pomare, pursued European medicine in order to address the serious depopulation and poor health of Māori communities. While at school, the young men had supported proposals for health reform and toured local communities encouraging the abolition of injurious customs. Maui Pomare was the first to embark on a medical career, and encouraged by the Seventh-day Adventists he met at Napier, decided to leave New Zealand and to study medicine at their Battle Creek College in Michigan. Pomare then attended the American Medical Missionary College at Chicago, graduating MD in 1899. In that year, fellow Te Ate students Te Tere Ripa and Peter Buck travelled down to Dunedin to begin medical training at the University of Otago. Medical training required a new attitude to the body. According to the ethnographer Elsden Best, the tapu from touching a dead body was extremely strong and prohibitory. It rendered the person unclean and unable to mix with his family or fellows until he had been purified, the tapu taken off him. As a source of defilement, the touching or handling of corpses was preeminent. Ritual cleansing, provided by tohunga in the past, was vitally necessary, even if those who had been killed were slaves who were thought to be without tapu. Such ideas had no place in late 19th century medical training, committed as its teachers were to the facts revealed to the eye, for example, by dissection. Te Tere Ripa, perhaps concerned that misunderstandings might arise about medical training in Māori communities, was moved to write about the experience of working in the room for cutting up corpses, and thank you to Lockie Patterson who alerted me to this. In the November 1900 issue of the Church of England Māori language newspaper, he discussed the Dissection Room, where he wrote that it was important to ensure that people have truthful knowledge about it. He described the room and the way the bodies were immersed in chemicals to preserve them, and again, thanks to Lockie for the translation. Students worked in pairs, and 10 students worked on one body. He noted that women were training alongside the men to be doctors, and that there was an important purpose in cutting up the bodies. It was not for pleasure or as a trick. It was to teach about the amazing aspects of the human body. It was a wonder of creation and made by Jehovah just under the angels. By the late 19th century, Christianity provided a justification for an act previously full of danger. In rejecting the existence of supernatural beings such as taipo and kehua, it emphasised a separation of the somatic and supernatural worlds. This became an essential prior separation to the public health work that these men undertook in the future. At a time when Maori were dying from a range of preventable diseases due to the dispossession of their land and the undermining of their communal culture by an emphasis on individualism, public health practitioners in Otago were preoccupied with separation. They insisted in separation of people from each other, hence the term overcrowding, with separating excreta from but containing it, hence pit toilets and handkerchiefs, with the separation of dirt from bodies, hence the centrality of hygiene, with the separation of animals from humans, and with the separation of water sources from animal contamination. These ideas about separation were underpinned, of course, by the germ theory, developments in bacteriology, and also middle-class views about the right ways of living. Germs and the need for their eradication were at the heart of public health practice. Germs were unseen sources of danger, and hygiene practices were the way to counteracting them. And thank you to the Hocken for supplying these wonderful posters, which are actually slightly later than the period I'm talking about. Traditional Maori communities had their own conceptions of space and separation, guided by the concepts of tapu, sacred, and noa, common. Ideas about the unseen sources of illness, and enduring links of whakapapa and land. These ideas and revered practitioners of healing who could interpret the influence of wider relationships had been undermined by colonisation. Old patterns of living in which latrines were well separated from housing and water supplies, for example, were undermined by land loss and relocation. And the tussle between these systems, the public health model based on unseen germs, and the Maori model of illness caused by larger unseen forces, tohunga became painted as culprits, keeping past beliefs alive. Peter Buck wrote in his 1910 Otago MD thesis, "The greatest factor which retards the progress of the Maori in health matters is the influence of the past." Present-day tohunga, he argued, had brought the once honoured name into disgrace. They were charlatans who played upon the credulity of the people to achieve notoriety and make money. The danger of tohunga had been marked in the Maori Councils Act of 1900, which was framed to give some limited self-government to Maori communities in order to promote education, sanitation, and to suppress injurious Maori customs. Such councils were empowered to prevent common nuisances in order to promote health, and to regulate the proceedings of tohunga, and to punish by a fine those, whether European or Maori, who practice upon the superstition or credulity of any Maori in connection with the treatment of any disease. Maui Pomare was appointed Maori Health Officer when he returned to New Zealand in 1901. By 1903, Pomare was arguing for a specific law to prohibit tohungaism. He realised that Māori went to tohunga because they had few alternatives, but he argued that properly qualified medical men should be sent to Māori districts. In that year, the Māori councils passed a series of bylaws to control tohunga, including licensing, which involved payment of a fee, but prohibited tohunga from charging for their services, forbade them from using a traditional practice of bathing the sick in cold water, and preventing tohunga who gained a following from travelling around and disrupting Tohanga. By 1907, concern of modern Maori men was such that they backed James Carroll's introduction of the Tohanga Suppression Act, which stated, "Every person who gathers Maoris around him by practising on their superstition or credulity, or who misleads or attempts to mislead any Maori by professing or pretending to profess supernatural powers in the treatment or cure of any disease, or in the foretelling of future events or otherwise, is liable to a summary conviction before a magistrate." I won't read you the whole thing, but the main thing is tohunga are now outlawed. For the first half of the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century was a period of both hope and despair for Māori. Hope that the population was increasing, and despair in that the rates of illness remained high and old ways of living were no longer possible on reduced lands. Traditional beliefs survived in new Māori religious movements such as the Ringatu faith. The refusal of a Ringatu community to accept a medical attendant led a Māori welfare officer in the 1930s to comment on their belief that God alone would contribute to the recovery of the sick. They genuinely held it. It was not, however, a belief that could be corrected by any form of compulsion. He said, "We must convince them that there are undoubtedly benefits to be derived by calling in a doctor or a nurse in a case of illness." Two Otago medical students investigating health conditions in Māori communities in the Hokianga in 1932 found people reluctant to discuss tohunga, effectively concealing their practices. All the students could glean was that tohunga were called upon in cases of serious illness, where they performed mysterious rites, used herbal preparations, and provided a psychological cure, even if the material conditions had not improved. The students found that the trees and shrubs widely used by the traditional healers in various preparations were efficacious, and found this work of the tohunga to be very commendable, but expressed great concern about the play on superstition. Evidence that superstition remained deeply ingrained, they noted, could be seen in the deathbed faith of the average Māori in the tohunga. Later student investigators also noted the resilience of resort to tohunga in communities. In 1948, one reported that in the Tikuiti district, the Māori doctor was intimately connected with the religious aspect of Māori life. His education on medical subjects had been handed down by his predecessors, and he treated his patients to the best of his ability. The student noted the fear in the community of hospitals and institutions which were associated with death. By the early 1950s, the New Zealand government employed film to engage Māori with the Western health system, and in particular, to be willing to have members of their whānau enter hospitals. In 1951, the National Film Unit's didactic production, which you can all watch easily on New Zealand On Screen, Aroha, a study of the Māori people, a young Māori chief's daughter is studying at university. Her embrace of modernity is such that she persuades her ill father to ignore the advice of the tohunga that he is dying among his people at home, and instead to enter hospital where he is cured. The very fact that the influence of tohunga had to be addressed on screen, I think, is testament to their ongoing influence. Repeal of the Tohanga Suppression Act took place in 1962 as part of a larger act pertaining to Māori welfare. By then, Māori members of the House, the Māori member of the House of Southern Maori, Sir Ererea Terekatani, believed that Christianity had put paid to primitive rights and beliefs, while the Pākehā Minister of Māori Affairs named the 1907 Act as a discriminatory piece of legislation. By 1968, in a symposium on the Māori people, anthropologist Eric Schwimmer noted that few Māori thought only a tohunga could cure all diseases, but they believed that in addition to natural causes, there are spiritual causes also. He continued, "Such a view is defensible on logical grounds. Even if the death of a child run over by a motor car has a palpably natural cause, we may still ask why this child had to die and why at this time. Only the spiritual realm, he believed, could help provide answers." Mason Jury, son of a Pākehā mother and Maori father, was immersed in both worlds growing up, but found when he entered medical school at Otago in the late 1950s that the study of disease has altered little from the paradigm encountered by the first generation of Māori students. Study was firmly based on discrete systems, an assumption of separation between mind and body, and lacked any sense of connectedness between systems, between comorbidities, and between people and their social and natural environments. Jury's decision to study psychiatry, he suggests, may well have been an attempt to match biomedicine with the wider appreciation of the human condition. That interest may have led him to study what was then called Mongolism and what we now know as Down syndrome for his 1962 fifth-year preventive medicine thesis. And I think in that very naming, we see how clearly medicine is embedded in cultural understanding. Jury's opportunity came when he studied at McGill in the late 1960s, where those working in community and transcultural psychiatry highlighted the impact of wider social structures of oppression, such as racism, in damaging the well-being of individuals. There, Jury's interest in the way culture determined how mental health might be conceived led to his determination to reconceptualise mental health in New Zealand in terms, he said, that made sense to my own people. The political climate of the 1970s and 80s allowed new directions in health, particularly increased attention to the Treaty of Waitangi after decades of Māori agitation. Working within these changed circumstances and supported by Māori leaders, Jury advocated for an Indigenous dimension to the health services, arguing that little would change until Māori had a sense of ownership over health, which required a recognition of, amongst other things, of the inseparability of taha wairua to well-being. This allowed agreement for the official restoration of tohunga into the health workforce. Tracing the history of tohunga suggests how a health service that ignored Māori epistemologies failed in terms of engagement and meaning, a recognition currently acknowledged, albeit in insufficient and patchy ways. The first Māori medical men fervently believed that their faith in science would be rewarded by improved health for Māori. Their efforts to protect communities through public health initiatives resulted in a denial of supernatural beliefs. Those initiatives led to clean water, better sanitation, and fewer deaths from preventable diseases. But such physical measures proved not to be enough for communities who clung to the wisdom of the tohunga. That form of Indigenous knowledge has resurfaced to challenge a dichotomy between physical and spiritual well-being, with benefits for the Māori community and perhaps beyond. I've traced 3 discrete episodes from the history of medicine made apparent to me through the archival and digital resources of the Hocken collections. The sad case of Mrs. Cochrane reminds us of the hazards of birth in the 19th century, of the competing interests of health providers, and the importance of the affordability of care. From Mary Downey Stewart's letters, we get a glimpse into the experience of a privileged patient in a private hospital and the assumed equal relationship of such a patient with her doctors. With the advent of more women in medicine and more Māori and Pacific practitioners, we have the prospect that many more people will feel similarly at ease with their health professionals. Insights into Māori communities provided by fifth-year medical students in their public health dissertations allow us to understand the dynamic interplay between Māori and Pākehā cultural practices around healing over time, with disruption, ebbs and flows, and the re-emergence of much older elements that reshape the new according to a much more foundational cultural code. I suggest we need histories of medicine in society in order to attend to contemporary health issues, and the Hocken collections provide a rich resource for such studies. We cannot understand who is vulnerable today without a knowledge of the past. Specific policies made an important impact, as our former student John Ryan McLean's 2012 PhD thesis on the 1918 Influenza Pandemic in Western Polynesia has shown. No deaths occurred in American Samoa, while 50 kilometres away, a quarter of the inhabitants died in New Zealand-administered Western Samoa. History helps us to understand why Maori communities living in economically and culturally deprived circumstances caused by colonisation currently have lower life expectancy than Pākehā. The recent survey of life and death in New Zealand by epidemiologists Woodward and Blakely suggests that health improvements amongst Māori relied on a paradigm shift to a secular worldview that conceives of illness as amenable to human intervention. But in the end, that notion of the triumph of secular science, as Mason Jury's contribution has indicated, is insufficient. Actually trusting Māori and Pacific communities to take their own measures in their own way in the COVID pandemic has led to effective quarantine in some iwi areas and very high levels of testing among Auckland Pacific peoples. Medicine exists, of course, to serve the suffering patient. We might hope that the revelation of kindness that Mary Downey Stewart experienced as a result of her illness in 1921 becomes the model for all today. Thank you.
Many thanks, Barbara. That was just fantastic. It was a lecture that spoke not only to the arc of your own work, but also to the incredible riches of the Hocken itself. I would like to introduce to you Dr. Miranda Johnson, who will respond to Barbara's lecture. Miranda recently joined the history program here at Otago. She came from the University of Sydney, but previously held positions at the University of Wisconsin and the University of Michigan, and her PhD is from the University of Chicago. So that's a pretty fantastic intellectual genealogy. Of course, reaching its apogee the moment you arrived here. She is an outstanding scholar of comparative Indigenous histories, critical histories of the law, and the history of settler colonialism. Her work has been deeply concerned with how we access the past and the political work that historical scholarship does in the world. And, of course, in our motu here. So can you please join me in welcoming Miranda Johnson?
Kia ora, Tony. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa, ko kapiti te mautari, ko Raukawakawa te moana, ko Ngāti Pākehā te iwi, ko Miranda Johnson tōku inga. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Tony, and to Sharon for the invitation. It's a real privilege to be asked to respond to Barbara's rich paper, and I'm especially grateful for the opportunity to be able to acknowledge Barbara's personal influence on me and her encouragement of my work throughout my career. I know I'm not the only student and scholar to have benefited from her attentiveness. Barbara always poses central questions of our time and does so with a light touch and in a resonant and personal way. This evening, her lecture has addressed themes of power, gender, race and indigeneity in the context of changing practices of medicine and public health. What could be more fitting for consideration in 2020? And woven through all her examples are connections to Dunedin, to the University of Otago, and even to Dr. Hocken himself. I want to address what I see as a central thorny question in the lecture, which concerns the making of medical knowledge and the politics of applying such knowledge in various colonial contexts. Barbara referred to this problematic several times in the lecture as one of separability. For instance, the separability of the somatic or embodied and supernatural or beyond the body worlds that modernising public health officials such as Maori Pomari advocated in aiming to improve what today we would call the health outcomes of Māori in early 20th century New Zealand. This involved attempts to suppress tohunga, or esoteric experts, whose own distinctions between tapu and noa, sacred and common, also worked to classify worlds, but according to different, some might say enchanted terms, rather than that of secular modernity. As Barbara elegantly points out, these attempts to separate and indeed to suppress tohunga did transform, but did not eliminate the status and function of these experts over the course of the century. Perhaps because, as Eric Schwimmer put it in Barbara's quote, medical science can often only provide answers in generalised, aggregated, or even abstract terms, and not in the highly particular, contingent ones that are so meaningful to us in our individual circumstances. Why this child at this time? Barbara provides other examples of attempts to separate out what medical practitioners regarded as good or modern science and bad traditional practice. For example, Dr. Hocken's argument against the midwife in court following the death of Margaret Cochrane after a difficult labour. In this instance, the attempt to separate a traditional or customary world from a world of science is gendered medical science inhabited and performed by credentialised men who charged exorbitantly for their services, and customary knowledge performed by women such as the midwife, Mrs. Waterhouse. Again, although modern science is powerful, it's not the clear winner in the contest. The charge of manslaughter against Mrs. Waterhouse is thrown out, and she appears to have had considerable public support if the applause in the court is anything to go by. So in alerting us to these attempts at separating the modern from the traditional, the scientific from the customary, and indeed the attempts to suppress the traditional and customary by the modern and scientific, Barbara's argument is not an anti-modernist or atavistic one. She's not arguing that we should or even that we can reclaim and re-inhabit some pre-modern customary world. But it does seem to me that she's posing for us, through sharp illustration, the central problem of modernity, which is the relationship of the modern to the pre-modern. While modernists assumed that the pre-modern would be left behind, relegated to the past, what in fact Barbara shows so well is how the modern and the traditional are co-inhabited, often in tense relation, and also how they shape each other. History as a discipline at times emulates modern science in its truth practices and evidentiary procedures, and the archive in this sense is a repository of fact and a place for establishing proof. But it is also deeply engaged in the ancient craft of storytelling. And in this sense, history is not only a modern knowledge practice. By engaging both modern scientific practices and ancient narrative arts, historians themselves cross that bright line between the modern and the customary. They can help us to see these thresholds and reveal how we all move between worlds, sometimes seamlessly, sometimes with difficulty and at personal cost. And particularly now, this is a lived truth that we can reflect on at the end of a year, benefiting from epidemiological knowledge in our country, expertly followed by our elected representatives, while at the same time we furnish our experience of and our commitments to our communities in much older, precious languages of care and trust that revelation of kindness that Barbara ends with, the stuff of story making.
Thank you, Miranda, for a very eloquent and thoughtful response to Barbara's lecture. We're going to have time for some questions, so the floor will be open. Barbara will respond, I'm sure. I'm not, but I will MC. So the floor is open. Oh, here we go.
Before I ask a question about the different experience of Samoa,
Just remember questions.
before I ask that question about Samoa, you referred to the New Zealand branch of the British Medical Association and its promotion of private medicine. See, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a historian, and I'm not a lawyer, but I believe what the British Medical Association was attempting to do was to keep the relationship between the GP and the patient subject to private law, whereas the hospitals in New Zealand were going to be subject to public law.
I think they were trying to preserve their ability to charge fees, actually.
Well, the fee was meant to be a peppercorn fee so that it could remain as a
Well, I think we could
law.
debate
However,
this, but they were very strenuously opposed to becoming state.
Yeah, I've got a different view, but Samoa.
Oh, you can put it differently when you write your book.
Samoa, what was the reason why American Samoa did so well during the flu?
You'll have to read John McLean's thesis. It's on Otago Archive, but it is partly to do with the American naval presence and the imposition of stringent quarantine.
Do we have other questions? Oh, sorry.
Yes, I'm interested. Hocken was the coroner in the Otago area. Do you know the name of the coroner that investigated the death of the patient? And do you think would there have been a friendship between Dr. Hocken and the other coroner, you think, which would have affected the decision?
Oh, well, actually, Hocken and Alexander did the autopsy themselves. So, and there, I mean, I didn't go into all the gruesome details, but there's a lot of debate about whether the cause of death was protracted labour.
Right.
But actually, they exaggerated the length of the labour. It wasn't 48 hours.
Right.
It was more like 24. So, yeah.
Other questions? Oh, Jocelyn? It is. It's the way for me to keep in shape and be heart healthy.
Barbara, can you tell me what's the present status of Dr. Smith's experiments in the Hokianga with paramedical staff? How do people think about that now? Do you know? It's just I found a pamphlet of his the other day, which I've given to Peter Crampton, and it's kind of weird, but on the other hand...
Do you mean the Dr. Smith of Hokianga?
I mean Dr. Smith, yes. Dr. Smith of the Hokianga.
I don't know anything about his medical experiments, but I know I quoted him in my fourth year long essay because he said any woman was liable to drop an egg at any time. So his views on fertility control were depended on women's sexual excitement. So, I don't know. I haven't seen these pamphlets, so I don't know anything about them.
Well, there was a history. There's been a biography written of him, but the interesting thing was that he used local people very much and trained them as nurses to go out into all the fingers of the Hokianga. Yeah. And the Maori were very trusting of him, as I understand. So.
Yeah, I don't know, Jocelyn. Okay. Sorry.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Let's run up the back.
Oh.
The young people.
Sorry, Grant, I didn't see you. Okay.
I'm interested in your lecture because of the holism you brought into discussing the evolution of medical epistemology. What do you think is the historical reason for the current move towards a more holistic version of medicine?
Complete dissatisfaction with the biomedical model. People feeling it was insufficient, so that would be my... There was a young person up there who had a question. Which...
You make it sound like we...
No, I'm sorry. I mean, I'm just identifying. I'm full of making errors today. Sorry.
Kia ora, thank you for the wonderful talk. I was really interested to see Dr. Agnes Bennett. I was wondering how common these female doctors actually were in the 20s.
Agnes Bennett trained in Edinburgh in the 1890s. She was Australian, actually. She found it very difficult to set up and practice when she went back to Australia. So it was very hard for women to be taken seriously as doctors. A New Zealand doctor, resigned to get married and asked her if she wanted to take over her practice in Wellington, so she came to Wellington for that reason. I have written another piece about her and the women she trained with, and they all write about the difficulty of being taken seriously and setting up in practice, so they're all very grateful for state appointments. So Agnes Bennett becomes the medical superintendent of the St Helens Hospital, and she's a fine general practitioner as well, and even in retirement she goes to the Chathams as a locum in her 70s. But there were great personal costs because it was impossible to be married and operate as a doctor in their particular era. I mean, it's kind of interesting because Elizabeth Garrett Anderson in London, one of the very early women doctors, did marry, but it becomes much more difficult later. Yeah.
Well, that's really interesting, thank you.
Yeah. Something I do know about.
So we've been talking about holism, and I have to say I'm noticing that this side of the room is carrying the weight of the questions. And I'm going to come over the other side and see if we've got any questions over here to balance out our conversation. So, Michelle.
Yeah. Good. I like basic.
Kia ora. Thank you. That was a wonderful talk. My question is, I was wondering, is it normal practice to have multiple doctor advice, I guess? So Mary's gone to see a woman doctor and a male doctor, and I'm wondering if you've come across reasons for why she's done that?
No. She only had called the midwife.
Oh, sorry. So
Mary Downey Stewart.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, because she was able to. She could afford it. The fees didn't matter to her. And I mean, I didn't go into it in great detail in this lecture, but it is absolutely fascinating, her desire to be kind of patronised by Dr. Herbert, as opposed to get realistic advice from Dr. Bennett. And she's even critical of Bennett. She'll want her £5. No, she didn't worry at all about what she was paying Herbert. So there's these really interesting gender dynamics at work. And I would like to know more about Bennett's association with the Bowen Street private hospital than I do, actually. Yeah.
I think we've got Jane, but can we just... Okay.
I think with Bennett. I think they did it together. Yeah. That's why Bennett had the photographs. Okay. I must say the revelation of showing you photographs of your internal organs was a rather wonderful gem in the archive that I think I was shrieking in the Hocken reading room.
Okay, I think we'll take maybe one more question. Have we got another one on this side of the room? I can cross back over if you require it, in the more loquacious side. And Oh, right in the middle. Thank you very much, Professor Skegg.
Do you think it may be the fact that Dr. Hocken charged fees that mothers of 10 in Caversham couldn't afford that actually is the reason we're here today, celebrating the Hocken collections?
Well, of course. Of course. I mean, but you know, one of the interesting things that Charlotte Paul reminded me of is that Frans Fanon, in his, you know, The Dispossessed of the Earth, said, you know, medical men who couldn't make it in the UK, or, you know, it was very overcrowded, the profession in the UK at the time. So when they came to the colonies, they flourished and developed a status far beyond anything that would have been available to them in small town, you know, Bournemouth or somewhere. So, you know, he's giving talks to the local, you know, about botany and, you know, becoming a collector in a way that would not have been, I think, opened up to him in provincial practice in England. And I mean, we can see that in Parliament too. A number of men become politicians, medical men. So they develop a status in New Zealand that they wouldn't have been able to achieve had they not been in a colonial context. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'd just like to end by making a couple of observations. Firstly, Barbara, what an amazing crowd that you've drawn. A distinguished mix of council members, former council members, academic staff, students, former students, and people from the city. It's just terrific. Can I thank the Vice-Chancellor and Miranda, particularly Miranda for her eloquent response, and the Vice-Chancellor for being here and opening the occasion so beautifully. And finally, could I acknowledge Sharon Dow and the Hocken staff and the events team for staging a wonderful event. It is truly fantastic that we could have the Hocken lecture this year and come together in fellowship and hear these reflections on a series of issues that are incredibly timely, and also to have this opportunity to celebrate the Hocken itself. So can we just end by coming together and thanking Barbara one last time.